It's working? Thank you so much, Wendell, for this nice presentation. And thank you to you and Thomas for organizing such an incredible conference with people from the entire world. And it's very impressive to be here in Zurich with such a setting to speak about the ordeal of civilians 100 years ago. Sorry. First, tragedy. You were a painter for theater set before the war. What are you doing now, sets for a tragedy? It's how these camoufleurs are explaining the war. And yes, the Great War. The Great War was a total global tragedy. Its setting, the entire world, its duration, 1914-18 and more, we have seen during this conference. Its main feature, mass violence. From the very beginning, the British, French, German, and Belgian governments made the war global by pulling the inhabitants and resources of their empires into it. This took place long before the United States entered the war in 1917. Countries, whether neutral or not, helped maintain the epic scale of the violence through industrial production of munitions, food, and other supplies. Sorry, it was, no, that's okay. And other supplies, while also seeking to uphold as much of the law of war as they could. In 1917, the poet Apollinaire, a soldier in the war, which means a civilian in uniform, was already asking himself, what should this war be called? In the beginning, people called it the War of 1914. Then, as the war carried on into 1915, it became the European War. When the Americans got involved, it became the World War or Universal War. The Great War has its backers too. The War of Nations could garner some votes. The War of the Races might also be defensible. And the War of the Alliances or the War of the People. But the War of the Fronts would perhaps express best the character of this gigantic struggle. For 100 years, the military fronts, land, sea, and air, and those who fought on them have quite rightly received the most attention. But I think it is time to study everyone else's war. Civilians were also caught up in the fight through their tremendous work to keep the supplies moving to the fronts where they were needed, and victims who suffered and grieved their losses. The military fronts cannot be understood without looking at those fighting on the home fronts, who too were completely mobilized for the war effort. Every man, woman, and child contributed in their own way. They are a little down, as you can see, the soldiers are at the top of the pyramid, in factories, fields, and schools. Civilians, so, were both collateral participants in combat, supplying the front with the fruit of their surplus labor, and collateral victims, suffering and grieving. The military fronts and the home fronts formed an immense, complex war machine. There were fronts on land, sea, and air, and sites of invasion and shelter, of labor, of military and civilian imprisonment, of battles against wounds and disease, and of mourning and remembrance. This sowed the seed for later catastrophes. In some areas, like here in Riga, civilians were at the heart of the war, invaded, occupied, looted, and bombed. They had become everyday targets in a total war. In these areas, outside the 4 walls of their laboratory, authorities tested their ideas of how to repress large groups, displace entire population, even attempt, in the word of the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time, the systematic extermination of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. We speak more about them this afternoon. In 1918, this French painter, Maurice Busset, did this large painting, which is called Bombardment of Ludwigshafen. He was so proud of his work that he signed it Aviator, a member of the New Cavalry of the Sky. He is not only a painter, he is a bomber. His own plane, as you can see here, I don't know how he did that, you can see it, can be seen above a factory in flame, bombs falling in a colorful, almost joyful setting, in which Busset, very patriotic, depicts the destruction of a German factory, perhaps one of those that had produced the gases used on all the battlefield since 1915. What did civilian life matter? The workers and residents of the area, when what counted was winning the war. The painting shows that in that conflict, civilians on the other side were simply the enemy, while at the same time not actually including any, as if they did not exist at all. I think this painting exemplifies the terrible novelty of total war. There was now more than one kind of front, sprawling military fronts, mostly made up of men in uniform, and civilian fronts, which were new targets and yet quickly forgotten. I would say, as Marcy said yesterday, that the Great War became a laboratory in a globalized world, an experimental site for testing practices of violence and for optimizing its effect on men and material. This experimental zone constituted an atypical front where artillery and gas were replaced by exodus, deportation, forced labor, and concentration camps. For civilians in such zones, to flee and to take refuge were positive actions compelled by invasion. I will draw up a general typology, too general today, in an attempt to establish some intellectual order among the multiple hostilities that affected millions of civilians across the world during the First World War. The difficulty of naming the different conditions of death or departure for exile and closing up in camps is attributable to the novelty and the complexity of the global phenomena. For the philosopher Walter Benjamin, the generation of 1914, 1918 had to experience, I quote him, one of the most monstrous events in the history of the world. He insisted on the insignificance of human beings in this radically new kind of war. I quote him, a generation that had gone to school in horse-drawn streetcars now stood in the open air amid a landscape in which nothing was the same except the clouds, and at its center, in a force field of destructive torrents and explosions, the tiny, fragile human body. What Benjamin, so perspective, hadn't understood, however, was that civilians had their own fair share of frenzy, not only on the home front, but in special zones, invaded, occupied, and up to the extermination of one entire people, the Armenians, plus the Syriacs. That's why I quoted the other day answering the beautiful lecture of Christian Gerlach by this quotation of Arthur Koestler in Arrival and Departure. I know we are in 1943, but I think it is so true for every time. Statistics don't bleed, it is the detail which counts. I think that neither statistics nor geography bleed, and that for us historians, we have to put the detail. It is what I will try to do now. I begin by the atrocities of the invasion and the refuge. In the occupied areas, the usual dichotomy between front and rear did not exist anymore. In normal wars, wives and daughters stayed at home, while the husband and grown-up sons went off to fight at the front. As you can see here, it is finished. And the atrocities are coming down in the middle of the villages. I give just few indications. You have here a city which is ordered to burn in Orchies, in the north of France. And what is the reason? The atrocities, the bestiality of the inhabitants. So the enemy always finds some reason to do these atrocities. But very soon come the rumor. From the reality of the atrocity to the myth of the atrocity. This is an Italian paper, the Asino, where you see German troops very far from Orchies, where the village has been really totally ransacked. But here they are cutting the hands of Belgian babies. Guess who has been winning the war? The same here with the butchers, two kinds of butcher. The German receiving these skulls from the Sultan, take them, it is a souvenir of the last massacres of Christians. Thank you very much for the Armenian genocide. And the same on the other side with Simplicissimus and Nicholas II becoming to be Nicholas Macbeth. So this is the reality, this is the myth like here in Punch. So myth take the place of reality. But in the reality, the consequence of making war total was the immense number of people who were now forced to flee their village of town to live or die elsewhere. Here, people from the north who go to the west of France, and the child drawing is particularly interesting. You see women and little children crying, weeping, not knowing what they do, but the little kid with like 6 or 7 already knows he's a man in charge. So even in the catastrophes of Exodus, gender is still working. But which words to use to describe what is happening suddenly, immediately, in August 1914? I put in bold here the different ways of saying that from the French Ministry of Interior is totally lost. Withdrawn, occupied, repatriated, uninvaded, recovered area, bombardment, departure, transfer. It doesn't know how to call what is happening. And this is obviously happening in the entire world. And you can see very easily that under here the pen of French artist, he put Serbs in one place, and on the other he puts people from Belgium and northern France being on the road. Except, and that's why representation are very difficult to analyze it, except that he did this drawing before again. And at the time, they were not in exodus because of the war. They were in exodus because they were poor tenants and they were expelled from their homes. This happened again, but because of the war. So you have to be also very careful. Even when there is not explained myth, it could be also representation which are not the right representation. That's why our work is sometimes not so easy. During the occupation, the problem, and it's why they leave, it is a destruction, like the mines here, which don't exist anymore, and also the occupation. And the occupation of churches is particularly interesting. How could you accept that in your own village, the enemy was the same face? He can be a Catholic, he is a Christian anyhow, he can be there occupying the church. The refugees so go somewhere else. Where do they go? Here, Latvian refugees, it's exactly the same thing. Where do they go? They go perhaps in the same society, down where they are not the enemy yet. But sometimes they are accepted, especially at the beginning of the war. It is so new, so you can make an effort. But after 2 or 3 or 4 years of war, you are fed up. And in France in particular, but it happens in other countries, the people who are refugees are not so welcome, and they are called the Boche du Nord. They have seen the Boche directly. So they have been biologically, perhaps, tainted with the Boschitude. And this is the worst which can happen. As we can see, we are already not in the world of refugees. We are already in the world of a new war in this language of the day. When you are coming from somewhere else, when you are somebody else, you begin to be from a different race. On the Balkan, Ottoman and Eastern Front, invasion, counter-invasion, and forced displacement made the movement and suffering of civilian population even more dramatic. You have it here with Serbian refugees. For the one who work on this front, you know very well that a number of times churches have been used to put women and children, sometimes to put fire. It was not yet the case, but they were shut for 4 days, like in Shabbat, and after they didn't know very well what the Austro-Hungarian wanted to make with them, but finally they were sent on the road. For the Jews of the Russian Empire, it was a little worse, as the empire was reorganizing himself internally. The displacement took the form of forced homogenization, reassembling and reordering society on social or racial lines. So in Russia, the military had no qualms about to treat, I quote, suspect population. Who were they? Jews and subjects of German origin. They were locked up or transferred well away from the front. This is called now, after the ex-Yugoslavia wars, ethnic cleansing. And it marked a turning point in the war. They were going from internal refugees to deportation. And a wave of pogrom coincided with other violence against Jews, nourished by long-held ideas among the peasants of the Jews are traitors, infidels, hoarders, and speculators. The authorities ordered the courts not to prosecute. People could, I quote, have a crack at the Yid with impunity. Many regular units committed war crimes, like these ones here. We are in 1915, and it is a drawing by the famous Jewish artist Abel Pann. Waves of anti-Semitic violence continued on a massive scale, as we have heard yesterday, between 1918 and the 20s as boundaries shifted and territories were carved out. The refugees, finally, could be said to be both the first to suffer in the war and the last, as this beautiful report of the photographic mission of the Red Cross done by one of the best photographers of the time, Lewis Hine, shows really well. Next, barbed wire and camps. I will begin, as you see, by this electrified border between Belgium and Netherlands, and explain what is happening by this text of 1917 by Gustav Adolf, who is at the time the ICRC president. And again, he speaks about this novelty. Civilian internees are an innovation of this war. And he asks that they should be the object of special attention, which in some regard is their situation in some regard is crueler than that of military prisoners. Yes, it is crueler, because military prisoners were very well kept by the Red Cross organization, not the civilian prisoner. They did not know what to do with them. So the war raised many questions. What should we call people who were in a particular geographical situation because of the conflict going on around them? They did not run away in time. They had become refugees, and sometimes they had been captured and locked up. Internees, deportees, prisoners. What should we do with them? They were not soldiers. There was therefore no international treaty to protect them. So the captured civilian has become a highlight of the First World War, but they were hidden even by the historiography till around 10 years ago. I exaggerate, 15 years ago. So now we have to try to understand what is a captured civilian during the First World War. Deportation became synonymous with concentration camps, like here in Holmensland. The detention, obviously, is administrative or military. It's never judicial, because the deportees are never tried or sentenced. The word deportation in classical Latin, it is for Thomas, come from cart, carry away. It means expulsion, or in Latin. The modern term blends both meanings, being taken from one's home and being expelled. Already before the First World War, these concepts were very well on their way. And they were fused by the means that made them possible, railways, and the objective, the separation of the civilians, all men, women, and children, from soldiers, so that the former would not bother the latter because of their family ties. This began in Cuba in 1896 and was almost reinvented in South Africa by the British during the Boer War, without forgetting the extermination, now called genocide, of the Herero and Nams of Namibia in 1904. So you see every time the use of railways, the choice of train, and you choose every time the choice of barbed wires. If you have tents or barracks, doesn't make any difference. And you have also every time the same thing. It is that the enemy thinks it is absolutely the worst which can happen, and does a lot of caricature and a lot of energy to say, in this occasion, it is the the French, who say that the British are the worst on barbaric people since they use the progress of science to put in camps the poor Boer during the Boer War. For the First World War, because Europeans had immediately made the war global by attacking other countries' colonies and calling on their own to come to their aid, the camps existed throughout the world in 1914. So civilian citizens of countries that had become enemies were labeled enemy aliens and interned in camps, not only in their home country, but also in all the colony. So you have two ideas: to mark the people and to log them. They are marked here by their photo and by the number. They are German in a camp in Australia, and again, German in a camp in New Zealand. Why I have twice? And again, comes the cartoons, and we have to be very careful about the cartoons. The cartoons are a way to banalize an awful situation. They are also a way to show things that perhaps you don't see out of the cartoon. So you have to be very alert to look at them. This Leka, who is a French cartoonist, you see what he does. He puts a painter who is drawing a monkey in a zoo, and the monkey is obviously German, and it is written on the fence. It is forbidden to excite the animal. And on the other one, you have this German with the crown prince, actually, who is taking a photo of a murder child. Does Leka believe in what he draws? I think he does. But in the same time, he knows that it is a cartoon, and the cartoon is supposed to make people laugh. How can you laugh in front of a murdered child? And it is something we have seen already with the Armenians with the skulls. We are going to see it again. So the reality is this one, the Liverpool concentration camp in Australia. Here, Ukrainian, we are interned in Canada. Why Ukrainians are interned in Canada? Because they are supposed to be Austrian. If they were Russian or Ukrainian, no problem, they will be allies. So you draw the line, and you don't know what you do. The mountains are very beautiful, like here, but they did not like it at all. Then you have German and Austrian internees in France for the same reason, reverse. And this is my favorite. They are Alsatian gypsies interned in the south of France. They are twice dangerous because they are nomads. You don't go where they go. You cannot keep an eye on them. And we see that playing again in the Second World War. And also, they come from Alsace, so they're Germans. So locked up from 1914 to 18. Okay, there is a war on, but this one has been put out of this house, which is a camp. It's a normal house. It's a camp. I suppose the soldiers who were looking at them should have been better employed at the front, but you see what are your priorities. This one were finally out of this camp, especially the very dangerous children, only in 1922. I go on and on these camps because I think it is so interesting to see that it is a banalization of the camp. When the first day Christian said the sanctuary of the camp, I don't take it. Okay, he is allowed to do that. But when you look at this, I think that even if I disagree with some of the people who speak only on the camps, there are other violence. There is definitely a point for that. And this banality you can see again in cartoon, like in this one, in This Kurt Weiser, who later on drew for Walt Disney, was very good for animals. You see, in one corner, here on the right, the German. The German are locked up in front of the emu, and in Germany, the German look at the emu. The idea is obviously, and the same banality on this cartoon, French cartoon, the donkey and the ox to the butcher, the other to a concentration camp. It's totally normal, 1915. It is the normality of the treatment of the civilian. Again, you can see it on this very beautiful painting of the Belgium, Maurice Lancaster, where these kids are locked up and they look through the fence, through the barbed wire, to try to have a look on their home country, which is Belgium. And to finish that, the presence of women in the camps was an extraordinary novelty of this war, which was so peculiar because it was mixing soldiers and civilians, uniforms with everyday clothes. And the woman with the bundles entering the camp with the electrified barbed wire of Holzminden are something of totally displaced. But why these women of Douai are in this camp at the other end of Europe? Because there was a bad incident during the Middle East war in front of Haifa. And so the Germans decided they will punish the French and the British by taking the women of this city of the north of France, occupied, to the camp. I don't think there is a better idea of the globalization of war than this episode. But there is worse, obviously, and I will say very little because we have the best specialist in the room. For Murder of a Nation, which is the title of a book in real time about the deportation and the extermination of the Armenian. Obviously, the Armenian of the Ottoman Empire represent the most extreme case. Indeed, the case was so extreme that there was no word at the time for their deportation, extermination, or annihilation, which were the different words which were used. The catastrophe grew out of the Turkish dread that their national security was at risk, and from the decision to begin ethnic cleansing Christians in Anatolia. For the young Turks, the Armenians were, and it is the same words again, powerful traitors and enemy within. They were represented as pests, as beasts, their humanity denied. They needed to be taken care of, shorthand, even then for murder. I will not go on this much more, just to say that in a very typical way of using the people you want to get rid of, the Turks blame their own crimes on their victims and claimed all the time to be defending themselves from this, I quote, civilized criminal. And I love this civilized criminal because it is an oxymoron, which is a perfect self-definition for all people who are going to become genocidaires, as we can say, after the genocide of the Tutsi of Rwanda. When deportation of Armenians to Syria began around April 1915, actually a little before, nothing has been done to prepare their arrival, and the result was that, and then that. I will stop on this photo of this site abattoir. I don't know how you say it in English, actually. How do you say site abattoir in English? It is because the abattoir means the place where you bring the animals. Slaughter. So it should be site of slaughter or slaughter site. Yeah, it will be more what was used at the time than killing field, perhaps, or something like that. So you have one on the left. On the right, you have again a train. And the train has been, and the telegraph has been very important in the deportation. And this train is very special because it is a train for little animals, which means that you cannot stay up, but you are totally crushed in the different places for the animal. So this finishes like in Rasul Rhein place, which is finally a death camp. So now what to do with that? Even as early as 1915, the massacre of the Armenians was being called a crime against humanity and civilization. But this was not an official term in international law at the time that had to wait until after 1945 at the Nuremberg trials. This was a cry of vengeance raised by the Triple Entente against the Central Powers and their ally, the Ottoman Empire. But although the Allies made much use of these crimes against the Armenians during the war as damning propaganda, they were quickly forgotten. Once the war was over, there was a shift from the banality of evil to the banality of indifference and silence. And you can see it very well on these cartoons again. As you know, it was this Italian newspaper who was the most advanced to describe the atrocity of the I call it a genocide now, the genocide of the Armenians. But you see how the pleasure of killing of the Turk in this sea of blood, and the same when he's fleeing this huge cross of blood. This has nothing to do with the reality, with the suffering, which what happens to the Armenians, except perhaps the lake of blood. Even so, it's not really the reality. The same with this French cartoons, where the idea is don't complain. Don't complain. This woman of France is going deported, perhaps like the one I showed you before in Holzminden. Don't complain, says the German soldier. You could have been aboard the Lusitania. So obviously it will be the end immediately. But the other one is even more interesting. Don't complain. What would they say if they were in Armenia? So in 1915, in real time, they knew that the deportation of the French and the woman from Lille was a crime. But they knew also that what was going on in Armenia was much worse. They did not have the words, but they knew there was something totally new. But when the war is over, and even after 1916, who cares? And it goes back to silence, and I come to my conclusion. The war began with many expressing their determination and willingness to take part. But this attitude shifted to rejection and outright pacifism after the war. As Freud said as early as 1915, modern warfare had produced extraordinarily traumatizing situations that nobody was prepared for. The mutilated bodies, the death of so many young people, an entire generation lost, and the massive destruction of homes and of hope. A 19th century vision of progress and civilization had left behind nothing but barbarity, cruelty, brutality, the expression of visceral patriotism, and which, whether it was accepted or rejected, fought or given into, will be reflected and refracted in the post-war period, in the private sphere, and in the political, literary, and artistic worlds. From its earliest works in the 1920s, the Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin was motivated by what had happened during the invasions and occupation of the Great War. In a report prepared for the 5th Conference for the Unification of Criminal Law in Madrid in 1933, he proposed calling these specific offenses against the law of nations acts of barbarism and acts of vandalism. He had understood, although he did not put it as clearly in the 20s that he later did, that the extermination of a people was not a random act of cruelty, but the essence of this kind of war against civilians and the desire to homogenize peoples and religions. Lemkin went as far as he could in 1933 towards finding a legal term that encompassed offenses against cultures and against individuals because they belonged to certain groups. He was, I would say, looking for a legal chain of reasoning that would enable such an unprecedented act to be punished. Invasions, occupation, atrocities, deportation, and massacres of civilians kept pace during the Great War with the radicalization of the fighting on the battlefield. And yet, they have been practically obliterated from the collective memory of the war. It will take another war, a yet more total war, for the word genocide to be coined by Lemkin. I would say that memory had been defeated. It was laid low by the hyper-commemoration of those who were seen either as heroes or as victims of the trenches, and by collective amnesia with regard to all the others, including the Armenians and the prisoners of war. Who now remember the fate of the British prisoners, mainly Indians, forced to march across the desert of Iraq to die there in their thousands? Even yesterday, we did not see these Indians. Raymond Aron spoke about those he believed had got it wrong post-1918. I quote him, "The Second World War reminding us that memory which was too faithful was just as dangerous as forgetting. The best way to precipitate a catastrophe is to employ the means that would probably have prevented the preceding one." Aron was thinking of the pacifists who would no longer go to war under any circumstance, and those who had not understood that loyalty to the soldiers of the trenches was preventing people from thinking about the war to come, the military aspect of modernity, the tanks, and the aerial bombardment. But Raymond Aron was very good to give counsels, but I show in my book that he did not understand a thing when began the extermination of the Jews, or not in 44 or 45, it was very easy to understand. But when Karski or Lemkin spoke about it in 41 and 42. So I come back to our war. I am very fond of somebody who is a German who had served as a translator to General Lyman van Sanders in the Dardanelles, called Heinrich Vierbücher. As far back as 1930, he spoke about the civilian deportation, and he spoke about this these slaughter sites we were saying about in a very international, in a very interesting paper called Armenia 1915, what the journal Imperial Government concealed from its subject, the slaughter of a civilized people at the hands of the Turks. And I quote a very small excerpt of this book. The 50 long months of terror engendered by the Great War did not reach their climax on the battlefields of Vaux and Douaumont, but in the mountain passes of the Caucasus, that Golgotha of the Armenians, which lies beyond anyone's imagination of horror, beyond even the vision of Grunewald, Goya, and Bruegel. For this woman of the north of France, she has to wait 1956 to get a political deportee card from the time in camp she did between 1914 and 1918. We just have to look at a few cartoons again. I wonder if Charlie Chaplin, who knew everything and everything, knew these very important cartoons during the First World War of German soldiers playing with the word and putting the word at blood. The danger with this kind of ideas is that when you really dance with the globe, nobody believes, finally. And the last image, Yerevan, 2015. I was there on April 24, 2015. It was very moving. And what they were asking, I remember and demand. I think we could still say that for the entire First World War. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can take a few questions.